Liturgical calendar. In a similar way as the Old Testament laws may be viewed as anticipations of Jesus as the living law, the Old Testament liturgical calendar may be interpreted typologically. We will reflect on the daily, weekly, and annual Israelite liturgy from this perspective. According to Exodus chapter 29 and Numbers chapter 28, twice daily, once in the morning and once in the evening, a lamb was to be sacrificed. This perpetual continual sacrifice, Exodus 29:38, is called in the Mishnah the tamid, which means perpetual or daily. The early Jewish historian Flavius Josephus identifies the second sacrifice of the day as offered at the 9th hour or around 3 p.m. From a Catholic perspective, even though the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and as a consequence, the Tamid sacrifices in the temple ended, the perpetual sacrifice commanded by Exodus and Numbers continues in the Eucharist, the application of Jesus' 9th hour perfect sacrifice on the cross. Matthew 27:45, Mark 15:34. This one perfect sacrifice of Jesus, Hebrews 10:12, is celebrated every time Holy Mass is offered. Each celebration of the Mass represents Christ's one perfect sacrifice, and in so doing enables us to truly participate in Christ's one sacrifice by joining our finite sacrifices with his infinite sacrifice. Along with the required daily sacrifices, the Israelites were also commanded to keep holy the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week. Sabbath observance recalls the day God hallowed and rested. The Hebrew word Sabbath contains the idea of resting since it comes from the Hebrew verb meaning rest. Leviticus reaffirms what the third commandment requires, to keep the day holy, the Lord's day. Numbers further states that during the Sabbath rest and celebration, 2 male lambs, a year old without blemish, are to be sacrificed and offered to God along with flour, oil, and a drink offering. In Christianity, as attested in Acts 27, the weekly celebration and sacrifice cease being observed on the seventh day. Instead, God was weekly worshipped, and the sacrificial meal, the Eucharist, was celebrated in a special way on the first day of the week, the day that Genesis describes God as creating. This is because Jesus rose on the first day of the week, Mark 16:9, signaling a new creation had begun, a creation springing forth from the grace given to us through Jesus. This grace received by baptism restores human beings to the intimate relationship Adam and Eve had before falling into sin. Christians, therefore, fulfill the third commandment to keep holy the Lord's day by resting and abstaining from unnecessary labor on the first day of the week and not the last day of the week. Because Christ rose from the dead, Christians, asserts the church father Ignatius of Antioch, no longer observe the Jewish Sabbath. In other words, the Jewish day of rest, but rather observe the Lord's day. Interestingly, according to Leviticus and other books of the Pentateuch, there are 7 yearly feasts, 3 in the spring, 1 in the summer, and 3 in the fall. The spring feasts are Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits. The summer feast is Pentecost, and the fall feasts are trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and tabernacles. In the Catholic faith, these 7 feasts are believed to be fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Passover, as explained earlier, comes from the Hebrew word pasa, meaning to pass over. This feast day remembers and in a certain sense relives the night shortly before the Exodus out of Egypt, when God sent a destroyer tasked with killing the firstborn. The destroyer, though, was commanded to pass over the Israelite houses and spare their firstborn, provided that the Israelites marked their doorposts and lintels with the blood of an unblemished lamb. So as not to forget this momentous day, the Israelites were commanded to relive the first Passover by eating an unblemished lamb. Exodus 12:46. This meal anticipated the sacrificial meal of the Eucharist, when Christians eat the risen body of Jesus, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. John 1:29. In describing Jesus' resurrection from the dead as the fulfillment of the Old Testament Passover, of the Exodus liberation from death by the destroying angel, Benedict XVI writes, and I quote, "On the night of Passover, the angel of death now passes over Egypt and strikes down the firstborn. Liberation is liberation for life. Christ, the firstborn from the dead, takes death upon himself, and by his resurrection shatters death power. Death no longer has the last word. The love of the Son proves to be stronger than death because it unites man with God's love, which is God's very being." The annual one-day feast day of Passover, during which liberation from death is celebrated, was immediately followed by yet another yearly feast day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. According to the Pentateuch, for 7 days the Israelites are to eat unleavened bread as a way to remember and relive the unrisen bread of affliction their ancestors ate when fleeing Egypt. Deuteronomy 16:3. When Jesus instituted the Eucharist, states the Catechism, he gave a new and definitive meaning to the unleavened bread that the Israelites eat during this feast day. The third spring feast day is first fruits. During this liturgical celebration, the first sheaves are given to the priests, who offer them to the Lord along with an unblemished lamb and a cereal offering. Leviticus 23 and Deuteronomy 26. In his first letter to the Corinthians, St. Paul refers to Christ as a type of first fruit of all creation. Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For as by a man came death, by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. 1 Corinthians 15:20-21. As interpreted by Petrie, Jesus fulfills this feast as the new creation's first fruit by his rising from the dead and ascending to his Father. Interestingly, the day the Old Testament priests offered the first fruits of the harvest corresponds to the day Jesus rose from the dead. According to Leviticus, first fruits is to be celebrated on the day after the Sabbath or the first day of the week. Leviticus 23:11. This is precisely the same day Jesus rose from the dead, points out Petrie. The summer feast of Pentecost is directly related to the previous spring feast of first fruits. According to the Pentateuch, Pentecost is to be observed 7 weeks after first fruits. More precisely, it is to be observed exactly 50 days after first fruits. The Greek-derived term of this feast day, Pentecost, is used in the Septuagint Greek translation of the Old Testament and means 50th, to signify the 50th day after first fruits. The Hebrew word for this feast is Shavuot, and simply means weeks, to signify the 7 weeks that make up the 50 days. On Pentecost, Shavuot, a cereal offering of new grain, Leviticus 23:16, is offered to God in thanksgiving for the harvest. On this day, as the Israelites thank God for his continual countless blessings, they are commanded to rejoice before the Lord, Deuteronomy 16:11. The fulfillment of what this feast day spiritually promises, interprets Petrie, will take place on Judgment Day, when, stated St. Paul, there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. Acts 24:15. This collective resurrection of the body will take place since Christ as first fruit has been raised from the dead. 1 Corinthians 15:20. On this day of harvest, Jesus will say to the sound grain or good sheep, "Come, O blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." These will rejoice. To the rest, the weeds, bad goats, Jesus will say, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." Matthew 25:34-41. Judgment Day will be, in a certain sense, the final Pentecost in time as we know it. On Judgment Day, The good will rejoice, while the wicked will depart in misery and sadness. This Old Testament's manner of relating happiness with holiness, which the New Testament builds upon, often, unfortunately, is overlooked, comments Hamilton. The first Christian Pentecost took place in the Jewish feast of Pentecost, Acts 2:1. On that day, 3,000 souls, Acts 2:41, were harvested for the Lord in preparation for the final harvest at the end of time, when their bodies will be reunited to their souls. The spring feasts and one summer feast are followed by 3 fall feasts: trumpets, Day of Atonement, and tabernacles. Trumpets being on the first day of the 7th month of a 12-month calendar. According to the Jewish tradition, this celebration marks the beginning of the liturgical new year, as distinct from the beginning of the first calendar month, Exodus 12:2. As the name indicates, the new year begins with the blowing of trumpets, Leviticus 23:20-25, and Numbers 29:1-6. 9 days later, on the 10th day of the 7th month, trumpets is followed by the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, Leviticus 23:27. According to Leviticus, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest, the successor of Aaron, the first high priest, is to once a year with the blood of the sinner offering of atonement, he shall make atonement. Exodus 30:10. Leviticus chapter 16 further describes 2 goats and 1 bull that the high priest was to offer to God. After one of the goats and the bull were killed, the high priest sprinkled some of their blood on the mercy seat in the inner sanctuary of the temple, called the Holy of Holies. The other goat, as explained previously, was to be sent out into the desert after the priest laid both his hands on its head, Leviticus 16:21. According to the letter to the Hebrews, Jesus fulfilled the rituals that took place in the Day of Atonement by entering into the reality that the Holy of Holies of the temple merely pointed to. Jesus did so by presenting as the one true high priest his crucified and risen self in heaven, the holiest of holies, the fulfillment of the Holy of Holies, Hebrews 9:24. As explained by Petrie, Jesus fulfills the Old Testament sacrifices on the Day of Atonement in a variety of ways. Through his ascension and glorification in heaven, Jesus, as priest victim, fulfilled the role of the Old Testament high priest and the sacrificed goat and bull. In addition, in his role as priest victim, who was crucified outside of the gates of Jerusalem, Hebrews 13:12, outside of the city that represents life, Jesus fulfills the role of the scapegoat of the Old Testament, who is banished into the desert, representing death, while symbolically carrying the sins of the people. Jesus, in contrast, actually bore the sins of all people and made atonement for all by his perfect sacrifice, whose salvific application is applied by the Church sacramentally as Christ's presence to human beings in time. The third fall feast is Tabernacles, also called the Feast of Booths, Sukkot, or in Exodus, the Feast of Ingathering at the year's end, since it takes place at the end of the agricultural season, Exodus 34:22. The other titles for this feast, Tabernacles and Booths, refer to the stipulation for the Israelites to celebrate this feast by living for 7 days in a temporary shelter that is to resemble the tent-like structure of the Israelites under the leadership of Moses dwelt in during their pilgrimage through the desert to the Promised Land, Leviticus 23 and Deuteronomy 16. Numbers describes in a detailed manner the sacrifices that are to be offered to God during the 7-day observance of Booths, Numbers 29. This feast can be spiritually interpreted as fulfilled by Catholicism in 2 ways. First, it serves as a reminder in this life we are pilgrims who, in the words of an early Christian letter, dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as if foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country. and every land of the births is the land of strangers. In addition, the agricultural dimension of the feast may be seen as spiritually referring to the end of time, when Christ, with a winnowing fork in his hand, will clear his threshing floor and gather his wheat into the granary, but the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. Matthew 3:12. The Israelite joyful gathering in the harvest and remembering that God has liberated them from slavery is ultimately fulfilled in heaven, as described in Revelation chapter 7, where a multitude of people from every nation are depicted happily praising and worshiping God. Revelation 7:9-10.